Very warm welcome and hello to everybody. Thanks so much for joining us to this out-of-the-box event organized by the Center for Humanitarian Action, which is a Berlin-based think tank specialized on humanitarian issues. My name is Ida Maria Tammi. I'm a research fellow at CHA, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. And as all of you already know, since you're here, the topic of today's event is climate change and the different ways in which anticipatory humanitarian action can help moderate its impacts in crisis-affected or otherwise vulnerable settings. And the event takes as its starting point the observation that we, or the humanitarian sector, is currently in a situation where global humanitarian needs are increasing, but at the same time, we're noticing that funding is decreasing. So how do we go about managing these increasingly scarce resources? What kind of promise is vested in innovative new approaches, such as anticipatory action? And what does a more proactive approach to aid provision mean in terms of equitable distribution of aid, funding, other resources? I would propose to divide our discussion into two parts. So we'd start with a short Q&A with our two guest speakers, whom I'll introduce to you in just a minute. In addition to which I'd be presenting some findings from my recently published paper called The Anticipatory Turn, Distributing Aid in the Age of Climate Change. And after that, we'd open the floor for audience participation. You're all very warmly welcome to make comments, ask questions to any of us three speakers using the chat function. So you can just type in your question there, and I will then read it out. In doing so, please indicate your name and organization, if applicable, in the message. But if you prefer to ask your question anonymously, you can always just send it to me as a private message. We also have live transcription available for those who need it. You can turn it on from the menu at the bottom of your screen where it says CC live transcription. And if any of you have any technical issues, the speakers included, the chat team is here to help you, and you can always reach out to any one of us. Finally, I would like to highlight that the event is being recorded and that afterwards the recording will be made publicly available online. So now, with the practicalities out of the way, let me turn to the speakers and we get to the interesting bits. First, we have Dr. Tanja Hendricks, who's an anthropologist and Africanist based at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, where she studies the work, motivations, and aspirations of Malawian civil servants in the climate change crisis. Now, what is more, Tanja is just about to begin what I think is a very exciting new research project, and it's called Taking a Risk on Disasters: Speculative Humanitarianism Amidst a Changing Climate in Malawi. And in the context of this project, Tanja will be studying what she calls future-focused disaster governance and the ways in which local government officials and humanitarian organizations anticipate and speculate on potential future disasters in their everyday work. It's great to have you with us today, Tanja. Thanks so much for taking the time. Our second speaker is Ms. Stephanie Lux from the German Red Cross. Stephanie is currently the Anticipatory Action lead at the GRC, and she's responsible for coordinating the organization's anticipatory action related activities in what I understand to be 25 different countries. She's also responsible for contributing to the methodological development of the approach at the global level, in cooperation, of course, with other Red Cross partners, scientists, UN agencies, and NGOs. So welcome, Stephanie. I have to say I'm really thrilled to have you both here, and I'm sure we have a really interesting discussion ahead of us. And with this, I propose we dive right in. And I would like to start with you, Stephanie. As many of you in the audience know, the German Red Cross was instrumental, vital, in first developing, testing, and then later mainstreaming the concept of anticipatory action, or as it was called at the time, forecast-based financing in the early 2010s. And luckily for us, Stefanie is one of those people who have been working with AA, anticipatory action, since the very beginning. So I would like to start this event by asking you, Stefanie, to take us back to the beginning, so to speak, and tell us a little bit about what was going through the minds of humanitarians when first developing the concept of anticipation, and what was the role of increasing climate impacts in all of this. Over to you.
Yes, so thank you. It was 10 years ago, maybe 11, it depends what you take as the point of origin. It seems sometimes very recent, but also if we look at what has happened since then, it is also quite amazing what has happened in that time that could then be considered long. I mean, everybody who was involved in this at the time was either a humanitarian or a climate scientist. So it was also our colleagues from the Climate Center. There were discussions on this at WFP, at Welthungerhilfe, at other organizations. What collectively, I mean, if you look back to 2014, 2013, 2012, right, this was ahead of the Paris COP. So the climate change, the extreme events having more intense, more frequent impacts, these discussions were much more at the forefront of the political discourse and of the discourse in general than today. And of course, as humanitarians, we asked our questions how to deal with it. At the same time, you had these technological achievements that forecasts were getting better and better and better, and we could see certain things coming. But if you also look back to that time, what had happened not too far back was the famine in the Horn of Africa, right? And that for humanitarians was incredibly frustrating because we had seen this coming. The forecasts were there that there would be less rainfall on top of already difficult situation. And yet our system, as it was set up at the time, did not allow us too much to mobilize funding ahead of the impact. So a lot of us were not only working on humanitarian response, right? We also work on long-term DRR, we also work on climate mitigation, but those are long-term planned funds that are also difficult to shift ahead of an event. And we have then response, right? A response funding that normally we get or got when it was already in the news, and donations and donor interest came to the impacts of these extreme events. So this was really at the back of it, right? This huge potential of forecasts getting better and better. The recent, still on our mind, frustration and the famine of the Horn of Africa that we saw coming and couldn't do enough against. And I mean, enough is still difficult, but yeah, we did not have funding to do much against based on the forecast. And then, of course, the growing attention and also growing evidence on extreme events getting more frequent and more intense, and us having to deal with it with a projection that humanitarian funds would not multiply in the same way than the extreme events did. So this was a bit when we first discussed this at the back of our minds, that just this window of forecasts and the extreme event, it was there, it was getting larger, it was getting more certain that we have it, but we couldn't use it yet in the financing of the system as it was then. And yeah, I mean, the forecast-based financing name, it has its advantages and disadvantages. We rarely use it anymore, but it still makes clear what was new, right? What was new was not to evacuate people or to, have the idea to do something ahead. These ideas had been around in the communities a long time ago, but the idea to have funding to enable things beyond evacuation, to really help safeguard livelihoods, health, and so on, to have financing not based on the disaster happening, but on the forecast, that was what was new. And in a way this name helped in the beginning to also make that clear. Not sure, Ida, that answered the entirety of your question.
No, that's a really good and interesting recap of the background and how we got to where we're now. And it's very interesting because I detect from your answer this kind of practical as well as ethical frustration with the established operational model when you see something coming and yet you are unable to react and respond because simply the way how the system is set up. So there's a strong kind of moral imperative behind anticipatory action, as far as I understand. Yet at the same time, I find it interesting that one of the arguments that is often cited in favor of AA pertains to its cost effectiveness. So again, I'm sure many of you know, but not only can anticipatory action reduce the cost of aid provision through preemptive action, it can also reduce the risk of long-term aid dependency, for example, by containing disaster impacts. And as Stephanie said, not evacuating people, but helping them preemptively, safeguarding local resources, etc. So as far as I can tell, and correct me if I'm wrong, 10 years ago when the concept was first being developed, these were already prominent arguments in the discussion, yet at the time, the future of public humanitarian funding looked radically different than it does right now. So I would be interested to hear your take on how do you see the development of the cost efficiency argument in the debate on anticipatory action, and role or prominence does it play vis-a-vis other types of arguments in favor of the anticipatory approach, such as increased dignity and effectiveness of aid provision, for example?
Yes, so I mean, just first, the moral imperative and the cost efficiency, they don't have to be exclusive, right? They mutually exclusive. They come together, and that's also what makes this approach so charming, because it has both. Like, it really also depends on who you ask, right? For me, from the beginning, and also at GRC, we focused a lot on showing how this reduces community impacts, how this reduces suffering and losses at community level. But as you also say, what came in and what I alluded to is we saw there would be more extreme weather events with more disastrous impacts, and likely not at the same scale more funding, right? So this cost efficiency, as you said, it was also from the beginning. And then, I mean, you've done your research, you know the numbers. There is the recent WFP report that looks at WFPFV that looks at the global evidence as of 2025, and you will find different numbers on it, right? Like from the $1 to $7, $1 to $3 to 5, 3.5, 1 to 1.3. I think it depends also on the activation, what you count, what you don't. The point is that if you are more efficient, if you plan better ahead, if you try to mitigate the impact on the community, then this will also help response, right? This will also make response more efficient. But like for me, I like to work more than with these global numbers, also with the community numbers. Recently, I think FAO, they invested $5,000 to evacuate fisher boats ahead of a huge storm. And then that saved like the entire value of these many fisher boats was 250,000. So just also these examples to say it makes sense, it makes economical sense. If we reduce the number of livestock dying, if we ensure access to water, then later we save the food assistance costs and so on. So it makes sense from a community view, which also is why we get increasingly buy-in from communities and governments to do it themselves, to think beyond evacuation. And of course, if you are saying like funding now gets more rare, more difficult for humanitarian assistance in general, right? This is the dynamics that we see. It will be even more important that if you have less funding for food assistance and long-term food assistance after a drought, for example, that you invest part of that amount to ensure that you don't need as much food assistance after, or maybe, in an ideal scenario, not much at all.
Thank you. So anticipatory action is increasingly prominent in the humanitarian sector. It's gaining a lot of popularity, both among donors as well as aid organizations. And as I mentioned in the beginning when we started, I recently published a paper on my own exploring what I call the anticipatory turn in humanitarian affairs. So exactly the shift of interest from what has always taken to be the standard norm of humanitarian action, reactive post-disaster emergency relief, and then this exploration of anticipatory and forward-looking approaches. And in this paper, I look specifically at the ways in which resources are distributed in contemporary aid provision, as well as the kind of different tensions that mark the relationship between the kind of traditional reactive operational model versus the anticipatory humanitarian approach. Time is short. We only have an hour for this event, so I won't have time to go through my findings in detail, but I thought I would rather kind of walk you through the key recommendations that the paper makes for humanitarian practitioners and donors who are either engaging with anticipatory action or then interested in becoming more involved. For those of you who are interested, the study is freely available online. You can use the QR code here on the slides. You can go to CHOW website, and I think there's also a link in the chat. And I encourage you all to take a closer look after the event. So in the study, I begin from the premise that anticipatory action, in fact, is a positive force, of course, in humanitarian affairs, as Stephanie already elaborated, as it can help combat the humanitarian impacts of climate change by making aid work more effective, efficient, predictable, dignified. There's some also evidence to suggest that anticipatory action can increase impartiality by relying on pre-agreed plans and operational protocols to determine how aid is distributed at time of crisis or at time of an imminent crisis. Interestingly, in the study, some of the people that I interviewed also pointed out or argued that anticipation can help challenge the kind of unequal power relations between donors and crisis-affected communities. And I found this really quite interesting. They spoke specifically about the way in which reactive aid provision relies on human suffering as a trigger point, so to speak, for humanitarian intervention. This kind of spectacle of human suffering, and how then acting preemptively removes this need for affected communities to visibly suffer before being considered eligible or gaining access to assistance. So again, as already discussed with Stephanie, a very strong kind of moral impediment behind this shift. And while this paper recognizes and agrees with these positive impacts, it also finds that the transformative potential of anticipatory action is currently limited by lack of operational funding. And this is not news to any of you who are already working with AA. On the one hand, this makes it difficult for organizations to put the plans and frameworks they've developed into action, and thus it limits their capacity to effectively address climate hazards in the areas where they're active. But at the same time, then the lack of prearranged funding also hampers these efforts to mainstream risk-informed activities in the aid sector, and ultimately it works against this kind of wish for a more profound change in the unequal power relations that underpin often humanitarian work. So in this paper, I encourage aid organizations to continue to explore and engage with anticipatory action, as there is a lot of merit and promise in the approach. Yet at the same time, I'm a little bit cautious about any inflated expectations in the current funding climate in terms of any large-scale structural or normative reform. In addition, the second kind of key observation that the paper makes pertains more to the way in which resources are allocated, as mentioned, between reactive and anticipatory humanitarian action. I focus specifically on the German case study. I draw on interviews with 18 Germany-based humanitarian and development professionals representing 12 different organizations. And based on this data, I find that kind of strong donor lobby or push in favor of anticipation could perhaps incentivize organizations to prioritize early or anticipatory humanitarian action over post-disaster emergency relief provision, even in cases where the latter could then be maybe better suited for purpose. Some of the people that I interviewed were particularly concerned that the pressure to invest in anticipation could lock the sector into what I in the paper describe as unfavorable policy positions, by perhaps promoting the anticipatory approach at the expense of reactive aid provision. I talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes when I discuss how some of the funding is structured. But the second set of recommendations pertains exactly to this kind of careful balancing act between different response modalities. While the paper acknowledges the value and benefits associated and the necessity for political backing for innovative new approaches like anticipatory action, it also cautions both organizations and donors against the risk of politicization. So in the paper, I call upon donors to allow organizations, humanitarian organizations in particular, the necessary autonomy and decision-making power they need to decide how to approach any specific crisis, while then at the same time encouraging organizations to ensure a balance between reactive and anticipatory approaches, both in operational as well as fundraising terms. This importance of finding a balance between reactive and anticipatory aid provision is further underlined by the fact that as of now, we don't have the data or the understanding to fully know how investments in anticipation impact traditional aid flows. There's issues like lack of shared terminology, lack of standardized reporting practices that make it very difficult to track the way in which funding moves through the aid system and how much of the resources that are channeled to anticipatory action can in fact be described as new money, so to speak, meaning that they're resources that are completely new and additional to existing ODA funding streams or commitments. So in this vein, the last point that the paper makes, or a suggestion, is to highlight the need for more transparency as well as comparable data on these different funding streams. While the overall share of funding allocated to anticipatory action is still very small, as was already pointed out, there's very little money to go around, especially for the kinds of second stage operational phases. So not only designing frameworks, but then putting them into practice and keeping them in practice in the long term. There seems to be strong donor commitment to increase this figure. This is something that I'm happy to discuss and explore with the audience in the Q&A, especially in the current funding climate. But still, I would maintain that it's essential that we continue to gather information, both quantitative as well as qualitative, as is the case with this paper, to kind of better understand where the different resources for anticipatory action come from, how they're allocated within the sector between different approaches or projects, and what kinds of forces, political and otherwise, then shape these different processes. Okay, but time is running and I will stop here. As mentioned, I'm very happy to take any questions later and very much encourage you all to take a look at the paper, which is then available on the CHA website. But now, moving on we've touched upon the origins of anticipatory action, as well as the different meanings that both donor governments as well as international humanitarian actors have given to the approach. But then what about the local perspective? And this is where I would turn to you, Tanya. As I already mentioned, you're an anthropologist by training, and your current focus is on the way in which Malawian civil servants understand and perform their duties vis-a-vis climate change. So what is it that you could tell us about the ways in which these local government officials navigate increasing climate risks in the countries that you've studied? Have you observed any competition between these kinds of emerging or increasing climate-related needs versus other pre-existing humanitarian requirements? Over to you, Tanya.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much also for having me here today. I'm very excited to be able to join, particularly on a topic that will be so central to my upcoming or forthcoming research project, on which I don't yet have empirical data in that sense. But I think many of the people in the audience will probably be familiar with Malawi. Malawi has been at the forefront of the climate crisis for a very long time. They've had to declare a state of disaster every year since 2019 and almost 8 times since 2015, so in the last decade, which is obviously not what the initial idea was behind having this terminology of being able to declare a state of disaster and request additional international assistance to deal with disasters. So it is definitely the case that these disasters, we all know, the inequalities that give rise to disasters being able to emerge in the first place plays a very big role. So in Malawi, this is no different. It's not a coincidence that Malawi is experiencing a lot of disasters. It is a very poor country. It is very donor dependent. 85% of the people rely on rain-fed subsistence agriculture to survive. So any change in weather pattern, whether this is a very big change or a relatively small one, has a very big effect on food security. And we've seen this cumulatively, in a way, manifest itself over the years. And civil servants, unlike humanitarian actors who come in when a disaster has been declared, which is of course slightly different for Red Cross, because Red Cross has national chapters that are always present on the ground. But the majority of humanitarian actors will come in when an intervention is being set up and when a disaster has been declared. And contrary to those who come in for the response specifically, civil servants are always on the job. So they are also there before the disaster. They will also be there after, and therefore you can see that in a donor-dependent and very poor, economically speaking, country, they have many concerns to deal with that kind of run through and exacerbate crises for some, but make them relatively profitable for others. So civil servants are very busy trying to balance, the kind of emergency timescale with more longer dating policies and projects that they're also trying to implement that are constantly being halted because of these repeated occurrences of disaster. And yeah, that sometimes leads to friction with humanitarian actors who have full focus on disaster response only, and not so much maybe on the electoral calendar, which can play into how much room to maneuver civil servants have, who might not be so aware of conflicts with specific chiefs or specific local authorities. And these are authorities that civil servants also will have to deal with after the end of a relief intervention. So they are obviously much more careful about navigating and balancing and managing these type of relations. I hope that answers your question.
For sure. Yeah, you mentioned that you're just about to begin this new project and you don't really have the data yet. But I've read your abstract and your project proposal, and in those you reference something called speculative humanitarianism, as is already, I think, in the title of the project as well. And I was wondering if you could tell a bit more about what you mean by this term and why you consider it important in the context of contemporary humanitarian governance?
Thank you for that question. I think so. Speculative humanitarianism, I should clarify, is my own conceptual term. So it is the term that I'll be developing through this research over the next 4 years, and I'm highlighting the speculative nature of be it forecast-based financing or anticipatory action or any kind of future-oriented humanitarian aid. Because I think it's really important that we see here that there's a break with empirical realities. So there is reasonable chance of a disaster occurring, right? Because we through AI we are able to amass much more big data sets. We can use with satellites increasingly predict the weather, etc. I realize and recognize that those type of predictions have become more reliable, and at the same time we know through the work of many scientists, but also anthropologists, that people at the forefront of climate change action will also increasingly call into question these type of predictions and these type of predictive models, because climate change also means that we increasingly have extreme weather events and things that actually don't follow these type of models and predictions. So I think it's really important to showcase here that the humanitarian community, in a way, is creating a much bigger legitimation and a lot more space to intervene and to govern in settings that they originally would not. Now, that's not a moral judgment. It's not a value judgment. I don't necessarily have an idea on whether that, or an opinion on whether that's a good or a bad thing. But I do recognize that because there's no more connection between something happens and then there's a response, the reactionary chain is kind of cut. Because that happens, it means that there's a lot more space for humanitarian actors to intervene and to do as they see fit. Which in general would be for the good of humankind, obviously, but this is a big change for local partners. And so in terming this type of future-looking humanitarianism speculative, I'm trying to show that it is a risk. There's a risk ingrained in it because it's not linked to any empirical reality in that sense. And there's this efficiency component. So in that sense, it aligns perfectly with the double kind of point that Stephanie was also discussing. And I completely also agree that the moral justness of an approach and its cost efficiency are not mutually exclusive. They can absolutely exist alongside each other. But what I'm interested in studying is how this is experienced by local civil servants or national level civil servants of a sovereign nation charged with protecting its citizens and fully unable to do so, therefore having to declare these states of disaster, etc., and rely on humanitarians to come and help them. And I'm just really curious to see these speculations on what kind of trigger values, what type of parametric insurances are available, what thresholds will be agreed upon to actually release this funding, and with which Malawi has a historical complicated track record. This is a case or a source of great anxiety for national level civil servants, as I discovered in my previous postdoc. So this is something that I'm looking forward into delving into more to better understand how they navigate the uncertainty in a way that is reintroduced in humanitarian aid by no longer by default being reactive. I think that's why I choose to front load speculative. But who knows, I might start doing interviews and realize that it's a term that doesn't make sense and that I might let go of it. But for now, that's why I'm sticking with it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, isn't that the beauty of research, that you go in with certain ideas and assumptions, and then you find yourself either proven or disproven, or more than often something in between, as I've also found in my own studies. At this point, I would turn to the second part of the event. So I would open for open conversation. Happy to have contributions from both of the panelists, reflections on any of the presentations were given, in addition to which I would then invite the audience to think up questions, share comments in the chat, and I will then, as mentioned, relay them to the speakers. And again, you have the chance to then write to me privately if you wish to pose an anonymous question to any of the three speakers.
Maybe I can start with some reflections.
Sure. Go ahead,
Give
Stephanie.
the audience a bit time to reflect.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Thank you for the two very interesting presentations. That I mean, for us, we've been working with researchers since the beginning, and it always gives them good impulses. Just want to clarify, not only as GRC, but also as part of this anticipatory action community, that I think no one of us is claiming that anticipatory action will solve the climate crisis, right? There's massive investments in climate mitigation needed, in infrastructure and development, in long-term resilience and risk reduction, and we don't say that, you know, this is less important at all. This is really about residual risk. And then a bit like linked to this concern that it's coming too dominant and that organizations don't have enough funding or flexibility for response. Just for me, like the numbers do not back this up, right? Like if I just look at what was allocated to active frameworks last year, it was 248 million, I think. That would be, and this goes against like humanitarian assistance of ODA being 24 billion, I think, last year. So it's a tiny percentage we are talking about, right? And if you look at ODA in total, even less. I think INAP came up with 0.7%. Even the GFFO has like the most forward and a lot of attention given. This is their profile thema. They commit to 5% of humanitarian response, right? And as talking for GRC, like even if I look like we are one of the pioneers, we are really proud of this, and it's still not at all the majority. It's like between 5 and 10%, depending on the year, on the crisis around. So just to say, like I understand that a lot of attention goes to it, but I'm less worried about the funding because, like, for now we are talking really even among the most active donors, a small percentage, right? And then just for Tanya, I agree on the importance of involving local partners. I mean, for the Red Cross, that's easy because our entire distraction system is owned by the local actor, who is also auxiliary to the government. So in all these DRM councils and so on. But I know that also all other organizations, like there are more and more countries now, Bangladesh, Mozambique, where the government is actively taking the lead and getting all the actors together, coordinating. So more and more there is exchange, and because many of these organizations are also longer there, right, for other programming and so on. And just want to say that, you know, all governments agreed to in the international conference resolution that we are proud of, for example, to integrate anticipatory action in their systems. They also agreed on definitions. Alessandra put the Grand Bargain Caucus outcome document, and Ida, I think especially for your research, that's critical because donors have now agreed on, you know, what's the standard definition, what do we count as funding, what do we not count, and also on this 5% goal. So this using forward will be super useful to track. Yeah, and just please, with speculation, I know it's a good topic, but it also sounds like we are reading tea leaves, you know, like I see that climate models change and that we are now moving towards a more positive scenario than what we maybe thought 10 years ago with the solar revolution happening and so on. But the weather forecasts, for me, they are beyond speculation, right? A 223 hurricane forecast of 5 days is now as accurate as a 2-day forecast in 2005. So we just see this being more and more exact. And for us, that's really like, you mentioned empirical data, that's like 100% data-based, these forecasts, right? That's not like speculation. So I understand the concept. It just sounds a bit as if we are just doing like, oh, will it happen, will it not? Yeah, that was it.
Can I briefly jump into that? It's really funny that you mentioned this, Stephanie, because it was actually one of the things that the funding committee for which I tried to get this grant from also pushed home and said, well, you know, in this time where, you know, science and the production of knowledge is already so much taking a heat and taking a hit, you know, especially if we look to the West, to our US-based colleagues, where climate change is becoming a very difficult topic to even discuss. I mean, with the word speculation, I'm in no way trying to insinuate that this is not also knowledge-based, but it is definitely
more uncertainty than
more uncertainty and linked to a future that is not yet. And so within anthropological understandings of the concept of speculation, there's very much this neoliberal component, so efficiency, speculating on what the right way to move forward would be, but also a kind of future making that is in no way intended to pretend that weather forecasts are not scientific. They are also grounded in scientific evidence, but not empirical reality, and that used to be the footing, the moral footing for humanitarian.
That's what I meant. Like, you know, we act up on like not there is a 30% chance, but we allocate this funding really when there's like an 80% probability that, you know. So I agree with the concept. It's just in the wording, not outside. It's
I'm going to look into that, because that's something that within my discipline I would not hear so much, and this is not indeed what I'm trying to communicate. So it's why I'm becoming, well, like Ida said, maybe I'll end up ditching the concept and coining another one.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation that's evolving, and in my own research, I've also been wondering that what is the role of social and political science in this debate that's dominated by very practical and scientific realities, and so how to merge these different ways of exploring and in terms of as a researcher, these kinds of research traditions one draws from. There's a couple of questions in the chat. I would also like to quickly respond to Stephanie. Maybe I'll start by reading out the questions, and then we'll take it from there, yeah? So, and apologies if I've missed any, please give me a heads up. So there was one from Alessandra Gilotta from the Anticipation Hub, as Stephanie already mentioned, sharing a link to an agreed definition on anticipatory action. You can find this in the chat, so please go ahead and take a look. Then Matthias Amling from Welthungerhilfe, a German humanitarian organization. So he writes, and I read out, as a preliminary remark, he would like to say that we might overburden anticipatory action if we expect that this one tool in our toolbox solves the climate crisis while delivering large-scale structural and normative reforms. We might need to make use of many different tools and strategies for this, including climate action, disaster risk reduction, rapid response, etc. And then his questions, he's got two main questions that are divided into many smaller ones, at least the first one. So Matthias is asking that, and I'm assuming that these are directed to me, it would appear. Given the current funding levels, where even one of the most advanced supporters, like the German Federal Foreign Office, the GFFO, with only 5% of its humanitarian budget directed to anticipatory action, do you really see an actual risk of anticipatory action being implemented at the expense of reactive humanitarian response, rather than just reducing the need for the latter? That's his first question. And the second one is, how does the, and here's quote, pressure on humanitarian organizations that you cite in your paper relate to this? Does that reflect in the limited funding that you likewise reported? Okay, that was question one. And the second question is that could the grand bargain outcome document be helpful for more common terminology and reporting? I will respond to Matthias in a few moments. And then there's another one, I think also for me, from Kabir Faisul, not mentioned from what organization. So it's pointed out that it's a dual challenge for aid organizations. It's true on the one hand that for humanitarian organizations or for the local and national government, it's challenging to declare an emergency until trigger is activated and a certain number of damage and losses happen. And they always refer it's a mandate to the development organization and development donors to deal with. I noticed this is probably to you, actually, Tanya. In your research, now I don't know whose research this specifically refers to. Did you consult with the OECD members or their respective divisions for their opinion or comments on this subject? So to start with the points for myself, there's many, and I'm trying to organize my thoughts. So to start with, by no means is anybody claiming that anticipatory action could solve whether the climate crisis or its humanitarian impacts. It's a drop in the ocean. It's a move to the right direction, and an important innovation or kind of rethinking, as already mentioned, not only on a programmatic but also on a normative level on how aid is structured and delivered from one actor or community to another. What I find in my study, and this relates to both Stephanie's remark on, I think you spoke about funding levels as well, and then what Matthias was writing about, for example, the GFFO only allocating 5% of its humanitarian budget to anticipatory action, and GFFO being the biggest funder and the only funder, as far as I know, with a fixed percentage of its funding going to AA. What I find interesting is the way in which, as concepts develop and take root, how competing discourses emerge and how these policies and practices can be used or utilized for different purposes. I'm thinking particularly of the way when I was talking of the importance of donor support or political advocacy in favor of innovation and anticipation, how anticipatory action has, for example, become very strongly associated with the German government, is really become the flagship project of the German Federal Foreign Office, which now we're in tumultuous times, but until very recently was one of the top donors in the world. So what happens when there's such strong political backing in pushing forward this approach, not only in the aid sector, but then into climate debates, into loss and damage debates, into discussions on how insurance can be used to finance recovery from or managing climate impacts in vulnerable areas. So how the conversation develops when it exits the humanitarian sector and the very practical considerations that drive aid organizations. And then maybe on the resources, one more point. We're already slowly running out of time. Just to say that when we talk about resources, we're obviously not only talking about money, and aid in very tangible terms, but also human resources where policy attention is afforded, how international debates in different policy fora develop. So how all of this kind of shapes the debate going forward. There's many questions in the chat. I would ask the audience members asking questions to keep your questions as short as possible, so that we have as much time as possible to answer them. So Nadia Rinaldi is writing that I understand the argument that anticipatory action makes responses more impartial, since action is taken only when predefined triggers are met. but those triggers are themselves designed based on certain assumptions and levels of risk appetite. So doesn't that mean that anticipatory action is in fact impartial in one sense, but still shaped by where and how those triggers are set? And this is maybe something that Tanya can also reflect on. Nadia also wonders if anticipatory action systems can only really be set up in certain places where design is feasible. So doesn't that mean that anticipatory action still ends up being uneven in practice depending on where it can be implemented? And this perhaps then is more to a technical expert like Stephanie, who could then reflect on perhaps anticipatory action in conflict-affected settings. And I'm reading this between the lines in Nadia's message.
Should I go now, or you want to read the other question?
Sure, go ahead. Why don't you do that, and I'll catch up on the questions.
So the impartiality at the trigger the trigger methodology. I think if you look at most of the methodology and then even the triggers, then yes, what's accepted as a trigger for cash out, that obviously depends also on the risk appetite of even the donors behind those pooled funds, right? As I said before, like most of us use very high percentages of probability of something extreme happening. And then when we look at, we look at past responses, most of us like to say, okay, in the past, this scale of event caused a situation that required international humanitarian response and where international response was provided. So you can say that's not completely impartial, but that's as impartial as we can get. And we really try to also use this impact-based forecasting, right, to really see, like, with the data that we have, where will the impacts be highest, what will the impacts be, and to not just say, okay, there will be this much rain, so we decide to act, but really to say, okay, we expect these impacts. This corresponds to what happened in that year where we also acted, so let's act now. For the feasible in which countries, I think it depends on how, like you can say, okay, but countries that have no weather stations, countries that have like a non-existent med service or very weak med service, can we then do it? We try to work a lot with the Met offices to really come up with locally owned plans with, that work in accordance with the government. But of course, in countries where that is not a given, there are alternative solutions also to use global forecast models, for example, and so on. I think there is always the possibility, like where there is a possibility to respond to a disaster, there is also a possibility to act in anticipation in most cases. It's just that there are, and this is either if you look at the numbers, like, and the FCAS list of the World Bank, what they categorize as fragile and conflict affected, like there's already 60% actually of anticipatory action funding going to these countries. Do they go to the active conflict pockets in those countries? That's the challenge we're working on, but we have to be honest that all other programming also struggles there, right? If we have these access constraints, then we also have them for response. We also have them for DRR programming and so on. So I think, like in most cases where you can do response with a little caveat onto the how, and maybe not in an ideal way, you can also do anticipation and fully take the argument with the impartiality. We all try to design our way, our systems so that they are as much based on the needs, really, as we do in response. But of course, there is at one point a judgment call, like how much certainty is enough, right? Yeah.
It is 2 minutes to 2. Is there something you would like to add, Tanya, on this question of impartiality, trigger development? You were also talking a little bit about triggers in your own presentation or remarks earlier.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way of phrasing it. What Stephanie just did, how much certainty is enough? Because in the end, even in an active disaster response, funding, or at least if I speak about my experience in Malawi, so I've been there during the last few big disasters, and my PhD focused on the 2019 response to Cyclone Idai. There's always uncertainty in a disaster because information flow is difficult. Areas that you don't hear from, you don't know if you're not hearing from them because they've been really badly hit, or maybe you're not hearing from them because nothing has happened there. There's always judgment calls to be made at different levels, and there's always the risk of sending a speedboat when you have only one in a district. You have only one speedboat. You have to decide where are you sending the speedboat to potentially save lives. You can make the right call, you might make the wrong call. You won't know until afterwards, but you have to make a call. And it's precisely in, not to do a shameless self-promotion, but there's a previous paper that I wrote about the frustration and the emotional labor that civil servants do on the ground before, during, and long after coordinating disaster responses, because they have to live with the knowledge that contingency was everything. Even if you're trained, even if you have your contingency plans, there's never enough resources to help everyone. Enough is never actually enough. There will always be people who don't receive sufficient assistance, and that is a knowledge they cannot escape. This is not something, their mission doesn't end after a certain amount of time, and they relate very much to local Red Cross volunteers on this because they also are embedded in the communities that are affected, etc. But this is a knowledge that is very frustrating to live with, and I think that ties it nicely back around to where we started this, because the fact that anticipatory action and the attempt to intervene before something happens obviously comes from this desire to still that frustration, to see something going wrong and being able to intervene before it really goes wrong and tips the threshold. But yeah, I look forward to mapping much more in depth how these triggers are negotiated and what specific country actors are putting in place in these discussions and how much knowledge they have to be able to negotiate. That is definitely going to be one of my foci. So I found this really interesting to listen to, and I've been writing down a lot of things, and the question of how much certainty is enough is going to stick with me. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanya. You kind of nicely took us back to the beginning in your remarks just now. And I'm very sorry to say that our time is up. Not all the questions have been answered, and this has been a very interesting and fascinating conversation. I would very gladly continue it. But we are, as said, out of time. So at this point, I would like to very warmly thank our two guest speakers for their insights and contributions, as well as the audience for your very active participation. And as said, I'm very sorry I did not have the time to address all of your questions. But at least Tanya's email you can find, I think, in the chat. Mine as well is available on the CHA website. So you're more than welcome to get in touch and we can continue our discussion. If any of you are interested in learning more about upcoming CHA events, I advise you all to take a quick look at the info chat, as well as to keep an eye on the CHA website for any updates. I know we got some really interesting stuff coming up, including events on humanitarian diplomacy, as well as innovation, which kind of nicely follows up from our discussion today. So thanks again, everybody, and thank you for taking the time and dedicating your lunch hour to this discussion. And I hope to see you all at our next Out of the Box event.